Support for Lab Out Loud is provided by NSTA, the National Science Teaching Association. Find out more about what NSTA has to offer at nsta.org. You're listening to Lab Out Loud, Science for the Classroom and Beyond. And our guest today is an explorer who helps us understand what it's like to face history with their work.
There are definitely sad notes inside of this. Like, facing that history is not easy. But there's something that is cathartic, that's transformative, that is healing about facing the history. There's something that is also beautiful about honoring these lives that have never been honored. And there's something that is fulfilling about being one of the folks who raised her hand and said, I'm gonna go help raise these stories from the bottom of the ocean.
That's up next on Lab Out Loud, but first, I'm your co-host Dale Basler.
And I'm Brian Bartel. You hear that little raspy tone in my voice, Dale?
Yes.
Yeah, I'm coming over a cold, and it's funny because, of course, yes, we're getting back together, right?
We did get back together.
And
yes.
Yeah, Dale and I came from a conference, a science teacher conference for the state of Wisconsin.
Yeah.
So yeah, we had people together, and lo and behold, I'm kind of nursing a cold.
Well, I mean, it could be that. It could be the many schools you work in. It could be the grocery store. Well, it's testing
season, and we had to. I literally touched hundreds of Chromebooks helping prepare them for testing. So
Yeah, and lots of hand sanitizer. But we should share with our listeners why we were at that conference. Brian and I were both at the Wisconsin Society of Science Teachers conference, and we received the Friends of Science Award for this podcast, Lab Out Loud.
Yeah, that was a fantastic honor, and many of you are involved in your own state and local chapters or science organizations there, and Dale and I are a part of Wisconsin that way, and so we started Lab Out Loud really as a Wisconsin podcast 17 years ago
2006. Yeah,
I mean,
it was really kind of, this show wouldn't exist if it wasn't for our involvement in a state organization at that time. Both you and I were emerging as leaders, or we're just getting started in leadership, and podcasting wasn't even really called that yet. It was kind of tinkering around. And I remember saying, I wonder if we could make one of these. And we had the organization as a vehicle to kind of convey information about science in our state. And then from there, NSTA reached out, and the rest was history.
So we've been doing this, of course, now for 15 years, of many of you have been listening, and it's been a blast. We've enjoyed doing this and delivering information about science education and science news and just in general science topics to you, the listener. So keep listening. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. And I was thinking about the things what are the broad strokes of things that I've learned from doing this podcast. And I would say that, don't be afraid to call. We've said this before. Don't be afraid to call somebody up.
Call an expert.
Basically, there's no harm in emailing somebody who you think is maybe not reachable, sending some messages and reaching out. If you get a no, you're just as far as you were before. So there's no harm in trying to reach out and get people to join your classroom or do an interview like this that you can use in your classroom, things like that. There's no harm in that. And that discussing science is what science is. I mean,
it's
science.
A process.
Science is a discussion, I feel, and these conversations about science need to happen in as many places as we can. And that's, I think, our tagline for the podcast is science for the classroom and beyond. And while that was a tagline at first, I really do believe that now, that anytime, stop, drop in science is the way I look at it.
Yeah, exactly. Well, it's also funny because I would also say one of the pieces I've learned is to grow beyond your own silo within science. And
oh yes, definitely.
Many of you know that Dale is like a physical science, physics, geology person, and I'm chemistry and biology, and it's been helpful to have each other there to kind of push us into different topics and outside of our comfort zone, and sometimes even like science adjacent. We've had a science comedian on the show, and we've had knights, we've had Nobel laureates, and many other people in between, and we've really enjoyed talking to everyone. But getting outside of our comfort zone in science has also, I think, made me a better science teacher within my own disciplines.
Mm-hmm. Well, and this episode is not any different. We are talking to someone who's definitely traveled out, possibly out of the comfort zone, because they did a little bit of diving. Our guest today is Tara Roberts, who is a National Geographic Explorer. Let's meet Tara now.
My name is Tara Roberts, and I am a National Geographic Explorer and storyteller. And for the past few years, I've been following a group of Black scuba divers around the world as they search for and help document slave shipwrecks. And it's been a journey.
Wow.
What's a Nat Geographical... Wait, how do I say it?
What's a National Geographic Explorer?
Yes, that's it. Thank you.
Well, I think that definition varies across the organization because there are thousands of us like over the years, but I think it's ultimately somebody that is exploring the natural world and helping to bring understanding to it, and in my case, telling stories about it.
So what's the process of becoming a National Geographic Explorer? Do you have like an orientation or a quiz, or what does that entail?
Just an online quiz, it's a Facebook quiz. You just
So wait, do you mean like after you've become one, or what's...
No, how do you, let's say we have a listener saying, that is what I want to do. You know how you walk down elementary schools and they have a picture of themselves saying like, I want to be a doctor, or, I want to be a National Geographic Explorer. We're hoping that students will have that kind of like, I want to do this.
Yeah.
How do you become that?
I think that is a perfect question, because I did not know that they existed. And so if somebody had told me how to become one, maybe I could have started this journey earlier. But you actually apply to be an explorer. National Geographic Society gives out grants. So every so often, typically it's twice a year, maybe 3 times a year, there's a call for people to apply. And if you've got an idea of something that you want to explore, something you want to investigate that's connected to the natural world in some way, then you can apply for a grant in a variety of fields. So there are education grants, there are science grants, there are storytelling grants. And you put your idea out there. You come up with a budget and a timeline for what you want to do, and you put in your application, and then you wait to hear.
It's like a big bat signal for, like a big signal in the air with the magnifying glass. We're calling out for all future explorers, right?
Okay, I would not have imentioned that.
We just went to go see the Batman the other day, so this is fresh in Dale's mind.
That might help, yeah.
So what facet did you tackle? I think it's the storytelling aspect?
Yes. Before I became an explorer, I was a journalist. So I come from a magazine background. I was an editor and a writer, and I'm really kind of passionate about telling stories. So I thought that this story in particular was super interesting because it dealt with the ocean. It dealt with exploring the ocean. It also dealt with history, and that is something that National Geographic is deeply interested in, history and culture. And at the time when I applied, they were really interested in human journeys. And so I thought that there was a really interesting story to be told about the journey of African Americans, and sort of starting at that point where most history books say that our journey started. So I was really interested in exploring that, and seeing what I could learn.
When did this exploration start?
My exploration?
Yeah, like this thread, I guess.
So I applied for the grant in 2018.
Oh, okay.
And I got it in September. Like I applied in the spring and got it in September. And then my journey, the first mission that I participated in, was in December of 2018.
I see.
You mentioned that you did this as a storytelling aspect there, and now that you've gone through the process and you've begun to tell your story, you have a podcast out, of course. How do you balance storytelling with maybe what we'd call science fact, or and there's probably a lot of unknowns in that as well.
Well, a lot of the storytelling that I'm doing around these ships is based in science. Like we're telling stories about the actual ships. We're telling stories about what it takes to find a ship. Like it all feels like it's connected. But then it is also telling stories about the people, which is maybe a little less science-based and more culture-based, more history-based. So I just realized I didn't really answer your question.
No, that's fine. Dale and I both work in elementary schools, and so the idea of storytelling sometimes invokes this, maybe a fantasy world, or and absolutely students get fact and fiction and a lot of in between there. And when you're talking about storytelling, you're telling a story that is something that happened.
Yes.
Yeah, I see where you're going with that.
Yeah.
Do you find yourself telling, like you mentioned, like how do we find shipwrecks? I could see that being more of a the story of the scientific endeavor, and then the human stories. Not that the scientific endeavor isn't a human story. Do you find yourself gravitating towards one versus the other? In addition to that, do you think like definitely this part of the story should go first versus that? How do you make those choices?
Yeah, that's a great question. I will say that I went to a liberal arts college. I love the creative arts, sort of steered away from math and science. I know this is a science podcast.
No, it's we often I'm enthralled by this conversation because sometimes scientists need to be much more adept at telling stories as a way of communicating science.
Yeah.
So we could be hanging out at parties together more, is what you're saying.
Brian went to a liberal arts college too.
That's right. Here's the thing, like what I found as I got deeper into this story is that I was fascinated by all the parts. And I think it's because it's so connected to something that feels personal and that feels real, that I wanted to understand all the pieces of it. So I leaned into the science and the math in a way that maybe I've never done before. And I found it absolutely fascinating. And I love talking about it. Like our episode number 2 is all about the science of finding shipwrecks. And what we found is that so many people are super curious about that.
Yeah.
Yeah, like there's something amazing about being under the water or below the surface, in your scuba gear, actually doing the work to find history. That's incredible.
Yeah.
No, and I liked listening to that episode too, and I think it's a real talent to be able to draw people into something like something unknown about scuba or under the water, for instance, and being able to describe what's going on there in a way that we might think, well, this is not much done better in a visual way. But you were telling an auditory story that I think is important to remember as well.
Can you give us a little, some of our listeners, a little sample of what that story was about?
Sure. So finding a shipwreck is not easy. That's a lot of what the episode is about. One, it probably starts in a surprising place. Like most people would think, oh, you dive around and you're looking for a wreck. But most of these particular kinds of ships, slave ships, were built in the 1600s, the 1700s, when they were primarily built out of wood. So when they wrecked, they didn't wreck intact. They wrecked in pieces over the centuries.
What do you mean? Oh, okay. Got it.
Over the centuries, those pieces, were encrusted in coral. They were made homes by marine life. Like you've got pieces of wood here, pieces of wood there. They're not going to find like the Titanic. You're not going to go and be like, this huge ship, and now we can see how it wrecked. No, it likely won't even look like a shipwreck. So the search starts really in the archives, and it starts with historians who are going through the records. And here's something that might be a little surprising to learn, but there are a lot of records about these wrecks. And the reason why there's so many records is because a lot of these ships were insured.
Oh, huh.
Yeah. So you know what happens when you have an incident in your house or with your car.
Claims.
The insurance company, they go and they investigate, and they need documentation to prove what happened. And a lot of these, the captains or the financial backers of these voyages, they want their money back, and so they would file claims, and the insurance company would come in and investigate. And so there are documents of like captain's logs, crew logs. Sometimes these people were called in to testify, so they're court documents. And those kinds of records help to pinpoint like where a wrecking event might have happened. And sometimes it's archaeologists who are doing this work. So it's historians and archaeologists. But then the archaeologists, they come in, they sort of narrow down a location, and they come in with equipment to begin to look in those areas for anomalies. But because, like the ocean doesn't stay still, you've got currents that are constantly moving things around and covering things and uncovering things. So it takes more than the eye to be able to find spots. So they use equipment like sonar scans and magnetometers that are looking for metals in the ocean or on the ocean floor. And once they find anomalies, then scuba divers get involved, and they come down and they look with their eyes and take cameras to see if these anomalies actually might indeed be something. And then once they begin to find things that seem like they might be unusual artifacts or pieces on the ocean floor, then they have to go through the process of seeing whether they are indeed connected to the particular ship that you're looking for. Because there are lots of shipwrecks out there. But not.
When you say lots, like how many?
So, I mean, just generally, there are lots of shipwrecks. And then when you narrow down to slave shipwrecks, and it becomes really specific. It takes a lot to narrow that down. But to answer I think the question you're asking is how many slave shipwrecks?
Yes.
Okay. Because I'm sure that there are, I don't even know how many shipwrecks there are. A lot.
Yeah.
Many, Dale.
Yeah.
I was just trying to get a ballpark, what does a lot mean in this context?
So with slave shipwrecks, we know that there were 36,000 voyages that brought 12.5 million Africans to the Americas. So you got 36,000 voyages. And they estimate that approximately, or I should say as many as 1,000 of those ships wrecked. And to date, less than 10 have been found and properly documented. So there are a lot of wrecks out there.
Did you say, I'm sorry to cut you off, 36,000?
Yes, voyages that brought.
Voyages. Oh, yes. Voyages. Okay. So that could be the same ship.
Yeah, some of these ships make multiple trips, so they're not exactly sure how many, but there are some estimates. These estimates aren't necessarily completely accurate, so we're not sure, but it could have been around 12,000 ships, maybe 15,000. We've also heard 20,000. So that's less clear. What we do know, and they have proven this through there's a transatlantic slave trade database. If you are curious and want to ever check it out, it's online. It's slavevoyages.org, and it tracks every single voyage that has been made during the transatlantic slave trade. So they know that it's about 36,000 voyages.
And that tracking is coming from the insurance records and things like that you were talking about, correct?
Exactly. Those kinds of records that historians have gone through and been able to confirm and prove.
Did you say 12 million?
Yeah, 12.5 million Africans were brought over on those 36,000 voyages.
And you mentioned in the podcast that about 12% didn't make it.
Yeah, that was a number that, it wows me. It astonishes me. But that number then is about 1.8 million Africans died in the Middle Passage. And one of the things that we note in the podcast is, who knew that number? That's not a number that is taught in.
Yeah.
There's a way that the Middle Passage is such a footnote often. It's like a little bit of history, if it's covered at all. But
it was absolute terror.
Yeah, it was a monumental loss of life. And those are people who have never really been mourned or grieved. They're not really memorials to this huge number of people who passed. I was speaking to this one group, and I mentioned that number, and some very entrepreneurial people inside of the group went and looked to see, what does that number really look like? How can we wrap our arms and brains around 1.8 million? And they discovered that the city of Phoenix has 1.8 million people in it. So imagine the entire city is wiped out. But again, no one notices it. No one says, hey, that is something for us to
acknowledge.
Something about. Yeah.
Honestly, the 12.5 million is staggering. I never realized that. I never knew it was that great of a number. Is this all to the U.S. or is it North America and South America?
Yeah, this is to the Americas. So
to the Americas.
Caribbean, South America, and North America. It's the full number.
Tara, go ahead, continue.
Oh, I was just going to say, so one of the things that we do in the podcast, back to your question about how do you balance the science and the other kinds of storytelling, what we try to do in the podcast is to also acknowledge and honor those people whose lives were lost. Like, we'll never know their names, but what we can do is acknowledge their passing. So we have a spoken word artist, a poet in the podcast who helps to give life and texture and fullness to that. There's such a way that we often think of those people who were in the cargo hold as not really people. Like, even I, growing up, like, they're just kind of statistics. You just see like people in a hold. And because it was such a horrific journey, like, most people don't even want to think about that because it was so horrible. Mm-hmm. But what we try to do is to imagine them as mothers, daughters, as husbands, as sons, as scientists, as
sure,
farmers, makers. Like, they were people. And so we try to bring honor to their passing.
Mm-hmm. Tara, when many people think of a shipwreck and finding a shipwreck, I think the image that probably comes to most people's mind is treasure. Mm. You don't use that word in the podcast I'm not done with it yet. I still have some work to do in listening, but I haven't heard that term yet. Was that a conscious choice?
Yeah, I think that the treasure on those ships were the people.
And insured, and that's the sad reality of what we're just talking about too, is that mm-hmm. we're not just talking about the ship being insured, we're talking about the people on it.
Right. And there was definitely not much care for the loss of that life, but a lot of care for the loss of the ship. Mm-hmm. So, yeah. And I just want to say this about the podcast and about this work in general, that there's a way that it feels like it is heavy, hard, sad work. But I have to say that my experience is almost the opposite of that. Like, there are definitely sad notes inside of this. Like, facing that history is not easy, but there's something that is cathartic, that's transformative, that is healing about facing the history. There's something that is also beautiful about honoring these lives that have never been honored. And there's something that is fulfilling about being one of the folks who like raised her hand and said, I'm going to go help find this history. I'm going to go help raise these stories from the bottom of the ocean and back into collective memory. And so that feels really powerful and exciting. And there's actually like joy in being able
I would even say illuminating. Yeah. If I could hear illumination, you have it.
I like that word.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
I do want to go back to even the archives here, because you mentioned something that caught my ear, especially in thinking about the archives. You mentioned they can be biased. And you mentioned that, it's really important for you to get down there with your own perspective and your own bias. We often in science tend to think that, bias is not a good thing, that we want to eliminate bias wherever we can. But you actually put a different spin on that, and that's an important piece.
Yeah.
Can you expand on that?
I don't know that it's possible to eliminate bias. Like, we all come into this world with our own histories and our own stories. And so I always love, this is a pretty common comparison, but like 4 people looking at a car crash will see 4 different things. And it's not that there's anything necessarily wrong with that. It's just you see life differently based on your past. And so I think acknowledging that is really powerful. And in acknowledging that, I think what becomes apparent is that there are perspectives that haven't been seen yet. And so that is one thing that is really powerful about having a group of Black scuba divers, Black archaeologists, Black historians looking at this history. What do they see that's different? And that's actually one of the questions that I had when I started this journey. I'm like, okay, one, does finding this history matter? And I think that's a clear yes, it does. And then my second question was, what difference does it make who finds this history? And I think as you explore the podcast, you listen to these various folks, like I think we interview somewhere around 40 people throughout the series who all have different perspectives. And they're different perspectives, not just because of the work. So scuba divers, historians, archaeologists are also looking at this slightly differently. But then even inside of the communities that are involved, so the way that Mozambicans are approaching this, there's a different lens. The way that Costa Ricans are approaching this, there's a different lens. The way that African Americans are approaching this, there's a different lens. And there's something to learn from all of it. So it feels like this history of the global slave trade, it's multifaceted. And it's not just Black people's history, like it's all of our history.
Absolutely.
There's so many ways to unpeel it and examine it and look at it. And it's important, I think, to have as many of those perspectives inside of it if we're really going to understand our past.
It's a little like the bias, the comment about eliminating bias before. I think about when I had my students in class and we conducted an experiment and we knew something wasn't, that there was data that was problematic or data that had more to the story, I guess. And so students were like, well, we got to get rid of that part. And one of the things we tried to talk about is like, well, maybe those numbers, we'll keep them, we'll strike through them for our model that we're looking at, but we'll keep them in there because that story, whether it's bias, whether it's perspective, those kinds of things, we're not going to eliminate bias, for example. We're going to document the bias, and we can grow from that.
And we know that we need some of that bias in other facets of science, and even in like drug testing, for instance, when we only test drugs on a white male population, we don't serve the whole population at large, and you need to have different perspectives, and that's obviously that's a piece that we all need to understand within, I guess, the global collective of education as well.
Yeah. Here's an example to me of the kinds of stories that might be unearthed with the different lens. Like there's a way that, most of the stories that are told about the slave trade, they focus on the horrors of the trade. And that is a very valid perspective. It's a valid story to tell. It's a necessary story to tell to understand what happened. And I have met women scholars who've been interested to find that, one, there were a lot of rebellions on these ships, which is often something that you don't necessarily hear. It seems like the people in the cargo hold were passive and they kind of just went from one place to the other. But no, they were actively rebelling. But here's the piece that I found fascinating and had not heard before. Apparently, on ships where there were rebellions, those rebellions were often led by women. It's not something that I knew. And it was because women were least suspected. But there were some like fierce warrior women and really.
How is that documented? How do we know that? Not the fierce women. How do we know that the rebellions took place?
There are documentations of some firsthand accounts. There are some slave narratives of people who were on ships. And then again, from those records, like ship's captains and crew, you have a lot of documentation. If somebody takes the time to go through them and thread the needle, then they can begin to find those sorts of stories. So that was something that was surprising. And I'm like, a different sort of mind would be looking for that kind of thing. But having that story adds to the collective story so that we understand that past differently. Mm-hmm. That feels really powerful to me.
Yeah.
I'm in the middle of episode 3, and it's talking about actually I love the story about Costa Rican students that are a part of this marine archaeology, and we've talked about place-based education on the show, and this just like tells me that this is alive and happening in other places. You know, I think about all the facets that you can bring into that type of learning with like oceanography, geography, weather, science, history, social issues, and so many things there that could be wrapped into that for students. Can you tell us a little bit about that experience? I don't want to. Yes, I can say go to episode 3 and listen to this, but give us a little teaser.
Well, what is so powerful to me about those students is how much they leaned into the work. Like, I think what you're saying is so right on. There's something about them being able to put their hands on history that made it come alive for them. So most of the youth divers started in this work when they were 14 years old. So 14-year-olds.
Wow.
And the person, so there's an amazing woman named Maria Suarez Toro who wanted to work with young people in the community. And this is on the Caribbean coast of Costa Rica. She wanted to work with them and to get them involved in stuff. And so she asked them what they wanted to do. And these kids were like, we want to scuba dive. We want to learn how to scuba dive, because many of them were fishermen, or their families fished, or they live off of the coast. And so there's a deep connection with the water, but they didn't know how to scuba dive. So Maria was like, yes, let's do it. And she outfitted them and helped them get scuba trained. And this young guy, Sanji, 14 years old, ends up finding one of the telltale artifacts that help archaeologists believe that the wreck in the harbor is indeed a Danish slave ship. There's actually 2 Danish slave ships that were reportedly wrecked in Costa Rica. So because Sanji found that bottle cap, it created all of this energy, brought more archaeologists to the space, and the kids were so excited that they actually found a part of history that they wanted to dive more, and they wanted to like outdo each other. So
sure,
more of them are diving and participating in the work. And then what's really amazing about the Costa Rica story is that it's actually a really interesting shipwreck story too, because the 2 ships, the 2 Danish ships, were traveling in convoy because they were afraid of rebellion. There had been a rebellion on the ship when they were loading up people off the coast of Ghana. And so they were really brutal in trying to make sure there wasn't a second rebellion. So they got another ship to travel in convoy, and they were traveling to St. Thomas in the Caribbean, and they got lost. Not once, but they got lost twice. And they ended up in the harbor of Costa Rica. And by this time, the crew had had enough, and so the crew mutinied, and they ended up taking over the ship, and they burned one of them, and then they took the other one. They scuttled the other one, and then they left. But what was really interesting about this ship is that they set the Africans who were in the cargo hold free on the shores. Now, some of them were recaptured and enslaved, but some of them disappeared into the hills, and they think that they married and connected into the indigenous population in the area, the Bribri. So what's fascinating is that some of the teams who were doing this diving and who I'm sure when they started had not made these connections, but some of the teens are of Afro-Bribri descendants.
Oh, wow.
And so some of them think that those people who were on the ship may indeed be their ancestors. And so it has started this inquiry by these young people who are no longer young. Well, they're still young, but they're now like 19, 20,
Sure.
21. And they've now been really leaning into stories of their ancestry and going to their elders and being like, hey, you got to tell me stories. Hey, I got to be able to trace this back. And so that history has...
Are they doing DNA investigation, you think?
Well, it's
Is that possible?
Not with that ship. I don't think, or at least not yet. There is another ship that's been found in Alabama where they are doing DNA tracing. But it's a little bit different because that's the only ship so far that has been found that is intact. And it's intact because the ship's captain tried to burn the evidence, and he burned the ship in the Mobile River, which is a very muddy river.
Yeah, I remember reading about this.
Yeah, this is the Clotilda. And so the ship sank, but it was preserved because it sank in mud. And so they are actually trying to get DNA evidence. But for, a ship that was sunk in the ocean, like that's a much harder proposition.
Tara, there's a theme that I feel like is going through the podcast, and I'm hoping that it's conscious there. I guess the idea of pairs, in remembering the story about the two ships here in Costa Rica, but I think about finding shackles because these people were shackled together in pairs, and then you kind of mention it with diving partner because a diving partner, when you dive, you have to have a partner there, and in some ways that's a great juxtaposition from being physically shackled to someone else. In diving, you hear yourself breathe. It's a very solitary piece, but your life is also in someone else's hand, or could be. Was that a conscious piece there? Was that do you see that duality come up within your experience?
Brian, you have totally found a whole new layer.
2 layers, maybe. No.
Wow, that's awesome. No, I never thought about it like that.
Well, and I'm thinking of it because when you're talking about your experiences, and because the shackles are one of the things that you have found, because that's an iron, that's the metal piece that might trigger the magnetometer, but that might also trigger some emotions.
Yeah. I would say that there's definitely a way when you encounter artifacts like that in particular, like artifacts that clearly show the brutality and the inhumanity of the trade, that it affects you, especially as you're beginning to imagine these people who were captured as real people. Like, it definitely hits you, and saddens you. And again, I think that there's this other piece to it too. And this is what we're trying to do with the podcast is to honor those people and that past. And so that also brings out another emotion. And there's something about those tears, about what you might feel encountering shackles, that helps move you to a place of healing around this history and this past. There's something about encountering these ships, and actually touching the material evidence of the past, actually looking at it embracing it, like not trying to hide it away, not trying to pretend like it didn't happen, not trying to say that it was not as bad as people say it is, but to really look at it and see it for what it is, then I think that allows you to begin to move through it and to the other side. It's kind of like when you get a boo-boo. I don't know if it says boo-boo anymore, but like if you don't look at that boo-boo, if you don't see what's happening with it, then you don't know how to address it and how to heal it. So there's something about working with these shipwrecks that is allowing for healing to happen. And that just, again, it feels really powerful and cathartic.
We had a conversation with a couple guests a few episodes ago about, I believe we were talking about global climate change. We were talking about loss of habitat and how it's affecting some extinction. And we were discussing, like, is it problematic as a science teacher to, I mean, we talked about this before about, you know, it can be really heavy and sad, but you didn't always feel that way because you could honor in other things. And as a science teacher, it can be problematic if you get, like you're talking about climate change, for example, and it's too doomsday, it's too sad. It's you know, it might leave your students in a place where they don't want to engage with it anymore, you know, and we have to be conscientious of that. But our guest at that time said, you know, but I want to leave my students then with, okay, something actionable to do. So what do we do with what we've learned? And it sounds similar. It reminds me of what you're telling us with your stories here. It's the same thing. Like, while these stories can be difficult, while these events can be difficult, that we have room to do something with that. We have the honoring and take action from that point on.
Yeah. So two things come to mind. One is that I think sometimes there is, not even sometimes, I think oftentimes, especially when it's about Black history, that there is a tendency to center in the pain and the trauma, and there's no place out of it. It's just centered in the pain and the trauma. And then that leaves you with feelings of shame, anger, guilt.
Super problematic for a classroom of adolescents too.
Yeah. But I think where the opportunity is here is not sugarcoating the pain and the trauma. Like, it's important to acknowledge that, but not staying inside of it, like giving students some place else to go. And one of the ways that I think that happens is by humanizing the story, because human history is full of pain and trauma, like full of it. Like, there's so many stories from every culture where people did horrible things to each other.
I mean, we can't and shouldn't excise that. Right.
And there's a way that we can talk about those things and examine them. And it's okay. Like, how many classes, like college classes, are there around World War II or World War I where we can
Netflix episodes.
We can talk about like the tragedies and the problems, and we can analyze them. But there is something about the slave trade, about slavery, about all the issues around race, where we're not able to do that. And it's partly because we haven't truly faced it. We haven't truly like looked at it in its eye, looked at it from all the points of view, and really like allowed ourselves to see it, to acknowledge the horror, and then to move through it. So it feels like with this history, with this work that I'm doing, this is another avenue, another lens for us to potentially get there. And this is going to sound like a bit of a shameless plug, but you know, I mean, we're talking about
we're all about shameless plugs. Let's go for it.
Well, we're talking about the podcast, and I want to say that this is a question that we really try to tackle in episode 5. Specifically, it's like, how do we talk about trauma without re-traumatizing ourselves? And that's what often happens. It's not, we don't discuss it sensitively. We don't discuss it in a way that helps us move to another place. But in that episode, there is a ritual and a ceremony that happens with one of the ships. And I think it is an example of what is possible. Participating or hearing about that and then visiting the sites afterwards gave me a way to, I'll say this, like, to embrace that past that healed something for me inside. And I think it healed something for a lot of the participants.
Well, we don't often give homework on the show, but I get you'll definitely have to listen to the podcast to engage in that a little bit further. Thank you for providing that avenue for us.
You're welcome.
Tara, thank you so much for your time, and we wish you the best in your next exploration.
Thank you so much for having me. This has been a lot of fun. I appreciate it.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Lab Out Loud. If you'd like to learn more about some of the things discussed in this episode or previous episodes, you can find show notes at our website, laboutloud.com. If you have a guest idea or a future topic that you'd like to see on Lab Out Loud, go to our contact page and send us a message. Also, you can subscribe to Lab Out Loud on your favorite podcasting app, such as Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, or wherever you like to find podcasts. While you're there, leave us a review and rating. Your input helps others find our show. Thanks again for listening.